Okay, so naturalism and legal philosophy, huh? That's pretty interesting. We're going to be diving deep into the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's article on naturalism and legal philosophy to see how it all works.
Yeah, it's really cool how naturalism, which is all about like observing the world around us, can influence something as complex as human-made as the law is.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
The article breaks down naturalism into two main types: methodological naturalism, or M-naturalism, and then we have substantive naturalism, which is called S-naturalism.
Right.
M-naturalism, that looks at empirical inquiry, so basically real-world data,
Uh-huh.
and it sees philosophy working like alongside science.
Right.
And then S-naturalism, that focuses on what actually exists, arguing that the world is made up entirely of like natural or physical things.
Yeah, and both of those have some really important implications for how we think about the law. Like, for example, thinking about M-naturalism.
Yeah.
It suggests that we can use those empirical observations and scientific methods to better understand and even critique our legal concepts.
Okay, so let's start with M-naturalism then.
Okay.
The article talks about this concept of continuity with sciences.
All right.
What does that even mean? Is it like philosophy trying to keep up with like the cool kids in science or something?
Yeah, kind of. It's more about recognizing that philosophy shouldn't exist in a vacuum.
Right.
It should be informed by what we're learning about the world through scientific investigation.
Yeah.
We can use scientific findings to kind of test philosophical theories and develop new ones.
So it's less about competition and more about collaboration between philosophy and science.
Exactly, yeah. And within M-naturalism, we actually have two main branches: replacement naturalism and normative naturalism.
Okay.
Replacement naturalism is that's the more radical one, where it argues that we should actually replace some traditional conceptual and justificatory theories in law with empirical theories from science.
Whoa, hold on. Replace philosophical theories with scientific ones. That's a little extreme, don't you think?
It can seem that way, but think about it like this. Instead of just relying on abstract ideas about what the law should be, replacement naturalism is saying, hey, let's look at what's actually happening in the legal system.
Right.
What patterns do we see? What does the data tell us?
Nope.
It wants to ground our understanding of law in what we can observe and measure.
So less theorizing and more observing.
Exactly.
Getting down to like the nitty-gritty of what's actually going on.
Exactly. And a perfect example of replacement naturalism in action is American legal realism.
Okay.
This is a school of thought that argues that legal outcomes aren't always neatly determined by legal rules and reasons alone.
Wait, so are they saying that judges don't always follow the rules? That sounds a bit chaotic.
Well, it's not quite that simple.
Okay.
American legal realists acknowledge that legal rules exist, but they suggest that other factors like social context, the judge's personal background, or even practical considerations can influence how a case is decided.
Right.
They're not saying judges just disregard the law, but rather that the application of law is a human process, and humans are complex.
Okay. Yeah, so it's like saying that the law isn't this perfectly logical system,
Right.
but it's something messier, and it's something that's influenced by like human judgment.
That's a great way to put it. It really challenges this traditional legal thought, which often assumes that law is clear-cut and predictable.
Right.
And they suggest that legal determinacy, this idea that there's one right answer to every legal question, might be more of an ideal than a reality.
That has huge implications, though.
Right.
If the outcome of a case isn't always clear-cut, then how can anyone be sure of their rights or predict what will happen if they end up in court?
That's a key question that's raised by American legal realism.
Yeah.
It highlights the tension between the desire for a predictable legal system and the reality that human judgment plays a role in legal decision-making. And it makes us question what factors should influence a judge's decision.
It's getting really interesting. It seems like American legal realism is kind of like poking holes in our assumptions about how law works.
It definitely is. And in a way, it's similar to what philosopher W.V.O. Quine did in epistemology, where he challenged the traditional idea of foundationalism,
Right.
arguing that there's no single, unshakable foundation for all knowledge.
So they're both kind of like challenging established foundations in their respective fields.
Exactly. They're saying that things might be more complex and nuanced than traditional theories suggest.
Okay.
Now let's shift gears a little bit to normative naturalism.
Okay.
Unlike replacement naturalism, which seeks to replace traditional philosophical ideas, normative naturalism wants to refine them using empirical evidence.
Okay, so it's more about collaboration than replacement.
Right.
How does that work in practice?
So think about it this way. Normative naturalism says, we still need philosophy to think about what the law should be, But let's make those ideas as practical and effective as possible by grounding them in what we know about the world. A great example of this approach is the work of the philosopher Alvin Goldman in epistemology,
Yeah.
where he argues that we should create norms for forming beliefs based on empirical research on how the human mind actually works.
Okay, so instead of just relying solely on abstract reasoning,
Yeah,
we should look at how people actually learn and form beliefs and create better guidelines for acquiring knowledge.
that's the idea. And this has implications for law, too, especially in the area of evidence law.
Okay.
The rules of evidence are all about determining what information is reliable enough to be used in court.
Right, so it's about making sure that the legal system is designed to actually get to the truth
Right.
and make accurate judgments based on, like, reliable evidence.
Exactly.
It makes sense that we'd want to use scientific findings about human cognition to help with that.
Precisely, yeah. And a key concept here is what's called the ought implies can constraint.
What's that?
This principle says that when we make normative claims, statements about what people should do, they need to be things that people are actually capable of doing.
Okay,
Right.
so you're saying it's pointless to set standards that are impossible to meet, right?
Right.
Like you can't tell someone that they ought to fly without wings.
Exactly. It's about being realistic. Right. The ought implies can constraint reminds us that normative advice, even in law, should be practical and applicable to real-world situations.
Right.
We have to consider the limitations of real judges, not some, like, idealized version.
Right. Which brings to mind Ronald Workin's theory with, like, his hypothetical Judge Hercules.
Exactly, yes.
He's this, like, perfect judge with unlimited time and resources,
Right.
and he always finds the single right answer in every case.
Right. Judge Hercules is a fascinating thought experiment,
Yeah.
but he doesn't exist in reality, and normative naturalism tries to bring things down to earth, focusing on what's possible for real-world judges within the constraints of the legal system.
So it's about making legal philosophy actually work for us rather than getting lost in these abstract ideals.
Exactly. So we've seen how naturalism encourages us to use these empirical insights to understand and potentially reform the legal system.
Yeah.
It's all about making our legal theories more accurate, practical, and grounded in reality.
And this has been incredibly insightful. I'm really curious now to see how naturalism, with its focus on the physical world, comes into play in legal philosophy.
Yeah, that's where things get even more interesting. Let's dive into that next. So we've already said that naturalism basically thinks that the world is made up of only natural or physical things.
Right.
But then how do we apply that to something as abstract as, like, conceptual as the law?
That's a great question. How do you take something like justice or rights, which seem
Oh.
like these big ideas, and like ground them in actual reality?
Well, there are a few different approaches.
Okay.
One is through Scandinavian legal realism,
Okay.
which actually predates a lot of the Anglo-American discussion on naturalism in law.
Right.
And they took a pretty radical naturalist stance.
Okay, let's unpack that then. Who are some of the major figures in Scandinavian legal realism, and what were they trying to do?
The two big names are Alf Ross and Karl Olof Krona,
Okay.
and they were all about reducing legal concepts to purely naturalistic terms.
Okay.
They were very skeptical of traditional legal language that talks about things like rights and duties as if they're some kind of mystical entities that exist out there in the world.
Oh, so kind of like how American legal realists question the idea of a perfectly logical system.
Yeah.
Scandinavian legal realists were questioning the language that we even use to talk about law.
That's a great connection. They wanted to strip away all the philosophical jargon and get down to the bare bones of what law is.
Okay.
Just like observing a natural phenomenon.
Got it.
To do that, they adopted what are called non-cognitivist and error-theoretic accounts of legal language.
Those are some big words.
Yeah.
Break it down for me. What do those terms mean?
So non-cognitivist means they believe that moral statements, including those that are found in law,
Okay.
don't describe actual facts about the world. Instead, they're expressions of attitudes or emotions.
Okay.
And the error theory part means that they think statements that treat legal concepts as real things are simply mistaken.
So when a judge says, like, the defendant has a duty to,
Right.
they're not describing some objective duty,
Right.
but they're expressing their own feelings about what the defendant should have done.
Exactly. It's a pretty bold claim.
Yeah.
And it really challenges these traditional views about the nature of law and legal language.
Right.
However, as with any radical theory, it had its critics.
Okay.
HLA.
Yeah.
Hart, very influential legal philosopher. He critiqued Ross's view of legal validity.
So Hart thought that Ross was missing something important about how law works.
Yes. Hart argued that there's more to legal concepts than just predicting what judges will do.
Okay.
There's this internal aspect to law,
Okay.
a sense of obligation that people feel towards rules,
Right.
which Ross's analysis didn't fully capture.
It's like saying that the law isn't just an external force,
Right.
but also a system of rules that we internalize and recognize as binding,
Yes.
even if we don't always agree with them.
That's a great way to put it. And
Yeah.
while Scandinavian legal realism maybe has lost some of its steam,
Okay.
there has been a recent resurgence of interest in their ideas,
Oh, really?
especially in the context of legal expressivism.
Wait, so their work from way back when
Yeah.
is relevant to contemporary legal theory today?
Yes.
What's the connection there?
It's all about this idea that legal statements are expressions of attitudes or beliefs,
Okay.
rather than straightforward descriptions of facts.
Right.
So legal expressivism is a bit of a more nuanced approach,
Okay.
but you can see the influence of Scandinavian legal realism in its emphasis on this expressive function of legal language.
That's really cool. It shows that these historical schools of thought still have something to offer.
Definitely.
Now, what about legal positivism?
Yeah.
I know that's a big one in legal philosophy. How does that relate to S-naturalism?
Legal positivism is another area that aligns with and is sometimes motivated by S-naturalism.
Okay.
The core idea of legal positivism is that law is ultimately grounded in social facts.
Right.
Things like legislation, judicial decisions, custom,
Right.
not in some higher moral order.
So they're saying what makes something law isn't whether it's morally good,
Right, yeah.
but whether it comes from some recognized source of authority.
Exactly. And you can see how S-naturalism would support that view.
Yeah.
If the only things that exist are natural or physical things,
Right.
then law, as a human creation, must also be based in those kinds of facts.
Yeah.
We're talking about facts about human behavior, social institutions,
Exactly.
things we can observe and study empirically.
It seems like legal positivism is trying to separate the is from the ought when it comes to law. It's
Yes,
saying, let's figure out what the law is first, and then we can have a separate debate about whether it's good or bad.
you got it. And a great example of a legal positivist who had S-naturalist leanings is HLA Hart. While he didn't explicitly call himself an S-naturalist, a lot of his thinking resonates with that perspective.
So for Hart, understanding the law meant looking at the social practices and conventions that give rise to it,
Right.
not trying to find some kind of ultimate moral justification.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that not all legal positivists are naturalists.
Oh, okay.
Some, like Joseph Raz, have explicitly rejected naturalism.
Okay.
So while there is some overlap,
Yeah.
it's not a one-to-one relationship.
It's a good reminder that these philosophical categories aren't always so neat and tidy.
Right.
There's always more nuance than we might initially think.
Definitely.
Okay, so we've talked about Scandinavian legal realism, legal positivism. What other ways has S-naturalism been used to think about law?
One more approach that we should discuss involves what's called the causal theory of reference.
Okay.
It gets a bit more technical, but it's really interesting.
I'm up for the challenge. What is the causal theory of reference, and how does it apply to legal philosophy?
So the causal theory of reference was developed by philosophers like Saul Kripke and Hilary Putnam,
Okay.
and it argues that the meaning of a word is determined by its actual referent in the world,
Okay.
not by some description or definition that we have in our minds.
So it's saying that the meaning of a word is grounded in the real thing that it's referring to,
Right.
not in our ideas about that thing.
Exactly. Think about the word water.
Okay.
It refers to the actual substance H2O, which is something that we can scientifically analyze.
Right.
The meaning isn't determined by our concept of water, but by the actual substance itself.
Right.
And some legal philosophers like David Brink, Michael Moore, and Nikos Stavropoulos
Okay.
have used this theory to try to understand legal interpretation,
Okay.
especially when it comes to moral concepts in law.
So instead of trying to define abstract concepts like justice or equality in some theoretical way,
Right.
they're saying we need to look at how those terms are used in relation to real-world situations
Yeah.
and what they actually refer to.
That's the idea. They argue that by grounding the meaning of legal terms in this way, all legal rules will have very clear applications.
Okay.
Either the facts of a case fit the meaning of the terms in the rule,
Right.
or they don't. No more ambiguity.
It sounds appealing. It seems like it would be a more objective way to interpret the law.
Right.
But is it really that simple?
That's a great question.
Can we always pinpoint the real-world referent of an abstract legal concept?
That's a great point, and it's where things get a little tricky.
Okay.
One challenge is that it's not always easy to identify the essential characteristics of these abstract legal concepts, like justice or equality.
Right.
Even when looking at real-world examples, there can be a lot of disagreement.
Yeah, I can see that. What might be considered cruel and unusual punishment today might have been viewed very differently 100 years ago.
Exactly. And another challenge is that this approach might clash with legislative intent.
Oh, okay.
What if a law uses a term in a way that doesn't really align with its natural or causal meaning? Should courts prioritize the literal meaning of the word or what the lawmakers intended?
That's a tough question. It seems like there's a tension between finding a clear and objective meaning,
Right.
but also respecting the subjective intentions of whoever actually wrote the law.
It's a tension that legal philosophers are still working through.
Right.
But that's what makes this whole discussion of naturalism in legal philosophy so fascinating.
Yeah.
It forces us to think critically about some of the most fundamental questions about the nature of law and how we should interpret it.
Wow. So we've gone through all these different ways that naturalism can really shape our understanding of the law. And it's made me think about what the law even is. Is it something objective, like we discover, like a law of physics? Or is it something that we as humans just create, like a game with rules?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? And I think both methodological and substantive naturalism kind of push us to examine that question in new and interesting ways.
Right.
So M-naturalism, with its emphasis on empirical inquiry, it encourages us to see how the law operates in the real world, not just in our theories.
It's like, let's get out of the armchair and into the courtroom and see what's up.
Exactly. And then you have S-naturalism that challenges us to consider whether we can ground those legal concepts.
Yeah.
Things like rights, duties, justice in something concrete and observable in the natural world.
Right. And as we've seen, there are all these different approaches, even within S-naturalism, each with its own take on how to ground those concepts.
Yeah,
Like Scandinavian legal realism took a very radical approach,
right.
while others, like those using the causal theory of reference, are trying to find a more nuanced way to connect legal concepts to real-world reference.
Right. What I think is so interesting about this whole discussion is that it highlights the connection between philosophy, science, and law.
Yeah.
We can't understand any of these fields in isolation. They all kind of inform and challenge each other.
It's like they're all having this ongoing conversation,
Reaction.
and they're pushing each other to refine their understanding of the world.
Precisely. And I think naturalism, with its emphasis on empirical evidence and its willingness to revise our beliefs based on new information,
Right.
it offers a really powerful framework for that ongoing conversation.
It really does feel like naturalism is pushing us towards a more grounded and empirically informed approach to law, even if there's still debate about how to do that.
Yeah.
This has been such a good deep dive. It's given me so much to think about.
Me too. And it raises even more questions for us to kind of explore further.
Like what happens next.
Yeah, like if we embrace this naturalistic view, what might it mean for the future of law? Could we see a shift towards more empirical approaches to legal reasoning and decision-making?
And how might our legal concepts themselves evolve as our scientific understanding of the world progresses? Those are huge questions.
Yeah, those are great questions. And I think this conversation about naturalism and law is really just getting started, and I'm really excited to see where it goes from here.
Me too. It's exciting to think about all the possibilities, and for everyone listening out there, I encourage you to continue exploring these ideas and see where your own deep dive into naturalism takes you. Until next time.